Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another session of our winter school. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Karen Sudmeier-Rieux. As I always say, Karen is an inspiration for me. She's really been a mentor and the reason why I started working in this field. So for me, it's a huge honor and a source of happiness to have Karen here with us. And Karen is also the godmother of this project, of this winter school. It's because of conversations with Karen that I got the idea of creating this program with Nidhi. I don't know if Nidhi is here, but Nidhi, feel free to tell us if you're around. I will briefly introduce Karen, and then I'm going to leave the floor to Karen so you can enjoy as much time as possible with our wonderful speaker. So just a few words. Karen is currently working as an independent consultant with a focus on nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction. She's also a senior scientist at the Technical University of Cologne in Germany. Previously, she worked as a senior advisor for disaster risk reduction with the United Nations Environment Programme in the post-conflict disaster management branch in Geneva. Karen has a very long experience, over a decade of experience with ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, and she has developed numerous training materials, including a postgraduate course and a massive open online course, Disasters and Ecosystems, Resilience in a Changing Climate. In the past, she has also worked as a researcher at the University of Lausanne, and she published extensively on landslide management in Nepal and community resilience. Without further ado, I would like to leave the floor to Karen. And welcome, Karen.
Thank you so much, Marta, and I guess it's good morning in the US. Good morning, everybody. I am calling in from the Geneva area, and it's really an honor to be speaking at the winter school. Actually, this year will be the 20 years ago since the first publication on Eco-DRR. And so this is quite an exciting moment in time, actually. So I will speak for about a half an hour, hopefully a bit less, and then I would like to keep enough time for good interaction. So let me go ahead. I've just kept the title pretty simple to Nature-Based Solutions and Eco-DRR for Disaster Risk Reduction, not really knowing what you've already covered. So it's also okay for you, Marta, to say, skip this. We've already covered that a lot. Because I don't want to have too much. A little bit of repeat is okay, but not too much. So basically just, well, actually it was only part one, but what are nature-based solutions, examples, and then what next? Part two was going to be an exercise, but we won't have time for an exercise in 1 hour. So I'm sure you've heard lots of people talking about nature-based solutions and what they are and hearing it from different perspectives. I have been using nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and Eco-DRR a bit interchangeably, although they are not exactly the same. So I might come back to the slight differences between the two. But basically, this field really did start. It started in several different places around the world several hundred years ago. We just didn't call it that. In Switzerland, protection forests were actually instituted in the 1300s. But the actual term was coined really in, I would say, 2013 when we started, when our team came up with the term and published that in 2013. But nature-based solutions also, the term was coined around 2012 through the World Bank, actually. And in the UNFCCC negotiations, IUCN came out with a definition around 2016, I believe. Then the European Commission, Horizon 2020, started investing. I think till date, they have invested around 80 million euros, which is about the same in dollars, in researching the topic. The IUCN Global Standard was published in 2019. And actually just this year, 5 years later, they're now updating that standard. The US Army Corps of Engineers came out with guidelines in 2021. And the World Bank came out with a really interesting urban catalog on nature-based solutions around that time, with European Commission. And sorry about these acronyms, it's like alphabet soup, but there just wasn't room to squeeze it in if I were going to write everything out. The European Environmental Agency came out with a policy, and things have just really skyrocketed since the last 5 years in this term. The United Nations Environment Assembly came out with a definition in 2022, which is really important. I'll come back to that. You may have already heard about that. Of course, there have been pledges, not only at COP27, but also at COP28, and private sector pledges. I just put COP15, which was last year or 2 years ago, and we had COP16 on the Convention on Biological Diversity, mentioned nature-based solutions as well. White House roadmap, which is now interesting what will happen with that, but also many national nature-based solutions roadmaps around the world. But one of the first publications on the topic did come out after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2005 with IUCN, which is what I was very proud to have published at the time. So around the world, there is greater perception that global risks are related to biodiversity loss and so-called natural disasters. I don't like calling them natural disasters, but disasters are more and more related to biodiversity loss. This is a survey that was published by the World Economic Forum. So even the private sector really is identifying biodiversity loss and environmental damage as being a risk to business, right? Their bottom line is profit, and the World Economic Forum is concerned about this topic. Now, we had a lot of hope when the Inflation Reduction Act was signed and started to be implemented in the US. I put a little light bulb up here because I thought it was like a light bulb went up in the White House at the time. And I think Marta was on that webinar as well. Right before Christmas, there was a webinar with an update on what has happened since the roadmap was initiated and signed, I think in 2023, if I'm not mistaken, 2022, 2023. And I was really impressed by all of these US agencies that have now implemented an NBS roadmap. And we're talking about Department of Interior, FEMA, right? The Federal Environmental or Emergency Management Agency, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is not surprising, but the Department of Interior, I was surprised they had something, and I was surprised that FEMA had something. What will happen to that is another question, but this work has been done and it has been documented, but we can come back to what might happen in upcoming years. But it was very, very impressive, and a lot of innovation is happening in the US on this topic, as well as in Europe. And this knowledge will continue to grow, even if it's not growing within the federal agencies. The people who've been working on this will bring this knowledge with them to whatever think tanks or at the state level where they will continue to work. Nature-based solutions, you've probably seen this before. If not, you'll see it again. Here's the IUCN, one of their iconographics on nature-based solutions, which looks at addressing 7 different societal challenges: climate change, disaster risk. I think this one is food security, human health, agriculture, water security, probably biodiversity, with the main goal being human well-being, as well as biodiversity benefits. Here is this UNEP definition that was signed by all of the members of the UNEP, of the UN Environmental Assembly. So this definition you may have already seen. I just want to point out again that biodiversity benefits are a key pillar of nature-based solutions. And of course, disaster risk reduction and climate change are among some of the main challenges that nature-based solutions, to which nature-based solutions are trying to provide a solution. This is the field that I am most familiar with. So this is what I'll mainly talk about today. Here again are the 7 societal challenges. The IUCN Global Standard currently has 8 different goals. You may have heard of these before. And these are right now are under review. Actually, yes, just yesterday I submitted my review to IUCN, and I was interviewed earlier this week to give my feedback on the standard. There are a lot of people who think this is useful, others who do not, or find it useful perhaps just for general information. I personally did not find it very useful for project implementation, and I let them know my opinion on that. And so I'm hoping that they can make the standard a little bit more operational. And just to let you know that there are other standards out there. IUCN isn't the only one working on MBS standards. You probably know very well about ecosystem services, which is a different kind of standard, and the 4 different provisioning, 4 different types of services of ecosystem services. Have you talked about this already, Marta? No?
Karen, this is super helpful in my opinion, because it really provides a very comprehensive overview. So please keep going.
Okay.
Yeah, this is very nice.
So this one actually came out. This has been out for 20. Oh, what's that little arrow? That arrow kind of came out of nowhere. This one came out about 20 years ago, and it gives a good, but it's also controversial, a good overview of the services from a human perspective that nature provides us. Because at the time we were talking a lot about how nature provides free services, and we shouldn't take them for granted, and they are not free. So for example, we have 4 different kinds. We have supporting services. This is nutrient cycling, photosynthesis, and soil formation. We take those for granted. Photosynthesis, we walk out in a park. It's like no big deal. But if we didn't have photosynthesis, we would be in a lot of trouble. Then we have provisioning services. We get food, raw materials, medicinal resources, fresh water from nature. We take that for granted. We open up our faucet, there comes water. If we didn't have nature providing us with fresh water, in many cities, for example, there's a huge cost, right, to making sure that the water, which may be contaminated, is clean, and the clean water that we drink. And same for all of these other regulating services, climate regulation, erosion regulation, etc. Pollination, there's a really good example. In some countries, there are no more pollinators. They have to do pollination by hand. What's the cost of that? I'm of course talking about cost because Marta is an economist and I can't help it. But all of these services now, we can put a dollar figure on. Cultural is a little bit trickier, perhaps spiritual values, aesthetic values, mental health. These are all extremely important ecosystem services that we're trying to quantify more and more. But this is more of Marta's purview than mine. It's just more important to keep these in mind. I had another slide. It looks like it dropped off. What happened to that? Let me just leave for a minute. Did I hide it? Why did this one not show up? There are also this one is also important, which is the restorative continuum by the Society for Ecological Restoration, which is based in the US, which looks at a different, like a continuum from reducing impacts to fully recovering ecosystems. Now, I don't believe in native ecosystems anymore because climate change and everything makes that, what is a native ecosystem? But I do find this continuum to be quite interesting. And it shows a somewhat different picture than the IUCN standard. Other than that, the World Bank is working on other standards, and the US Army Corps of Engineers has now different standards, but those are for slightly different purposes. The US Army Corps of Engineers is our standards more for ecological engineering. Okay. Have you already talked a lot about disaster and disaster risk, Marta?
Yes, we discussed a bit about it, but this is, I think, a very comprehensive overview that you are giving. It's
All
very
right. So I just want to refresh your memory on a disaster. What is disaster risk? And again, it's something that is so overwhelming that a society cannot cope with it, right? A disaster. And it's important that we consider the different components of disaster: the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And the reason why is because ecosystems can reduce all 3 components of disasters. And it's important to understand how they do that and why this is important. So again, a quick overview is Hazards are the so-called natural phenomena. I say that within quotes because climate change is now impacting several of these, but not all of them. Of course, heat waves and cold spells. It should not be snowing in Louisiana right now, probably, but this is probably very much climate related. Geophysical events, earthquakes and tsunamis, volcano eruptions. There is research to see whether climate change is increasing the frequency of these, but that has not yet been determined from what I can tell. So these are still not climate related. And not all of these are increasing around the world due to climate change. Many of these are increasing due to other factors, though. I'll come back to that. Vulnerability. Again, nature can also help us in reducing vulnerability. So vulnerability has more to do with the type of physical, social, economic, and environmental factors which make us as individuals or communities more susceptible towards the type of hazard impacts that may come our way. Okay, so if we're not just poverty, right, but it could also be if we have very few access to resources. Doesn't always mean having to do with poverty. And this one is extremely important, which is exposure. And it's sometimes hard to understand the difference between vulnerability and exposure. Hopefully this photo from Nepal will help though. This was a satellite image that I worked on with my students when I was at the university, and we were studying landslides, and my students said, wow, look at this, Karen, the difference in 5 years. People have moved into the riverbed. And we actually interviewed a lot of those people. And they were saying, well, they moved here because they were affected by landslides in the mountains. And they knew that they would probably be flooded, but they preferred to live here because they had more access to education near a bigger city than when they lived in the mountains. So if this area is to be flooded, are we to blame climate change for this? Are we to say that this is a natural disaster? No, this would not be a natural disaster. This has to do with poor land use planning. This has to do with people being desperate and living in an area where they shouldn't be living, right? So exposure is extremely important in understanding how to reduce disaster risk reduction. It could be done through nature-based solutions, but nature-based solutions may not be the main solution to reducing disaster risk in this area. It may mainly be land use planning. Look at what's happening in LA right now with the wildfires as well. Exposure has a lot to do with that. Okay, so this exposure is very important for understanding the situation of people living in a hazard-prone area. So can ecosystems reduce all three of these components? This is another example of one of our colleagues, Brian McAdoo from Duke University, who was visiting Sri Lanka 2 years after the Indian Ocean tsunami. And he visited this really nice dune park. And you can barely see there are some houses down here. And this is an ecotourism resort. This is a national park, which is wildlife habitat for some turtle species. There was 5 centimeters of water that affected this ecotourism resort after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and no casualties. Just 2 kilometers, let's say a mile down the beach, this area, they had removed the sand dunes for better ocean views. 7-meter wave hit this area and 27 casualties occurred. There's actually a really powerful book about somebody staying at this hotel, I think a New York Times journalist, called The Wave. And it talks a bit about how she actually lost her family at this resort. So this can really show us how nature can really protect and provide for us if we will allow nature to protect and provide for us. So this is a good and tragic example how ecosystems can reduce all 3 components. So yes, exposure. If we have a sand dune here instead of a hotel, we're actually reducing our exposure. Vulnerability. Is this a great place for fishing? We actually get fish, right? We get ecosystem services, provisioning services from the ecosystem. So it does reduce our vulnerability. And hazard impact. It is a physical barrier to storm surges. So it actually reduces the hazard itself, the impact of the hazard. It reduces the energy of the hazard. Now, not all ecosystems, like there was a lot of talk about mangroves as saving people during the Indian Ocean tsunami. This is one reason why I was asked to write this little first book. Mangroves is probably overblown as being able to stop a 7-meter wave. So we also have to be very realistic about what nature can do in terms of protection. Mangroves are mainly good at stopping smaller storm surges. So moving on, examples of nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction. So I'm quite a proponent of this movement. There's a whole website on this, that disasters are not natural. I think my example from Nepal was quite a strong example of that. I tend to fight this terminology of natural disasters. I'll come back to, I think I'll be explaining this photo. This is the border between Haiti and Dominican Republic. Haiti's on the left, Dominican Republic's on the right. You probably know a little bit of the history of Haiti as to why it's become so barren, mainly having to do with colonial issues and really lack of any stable government. So what happened in 2004 when a storm hit the island, starting in Dominican Republic? Huge amount of casualties in Haiti, 18 casualties in Dominican Republic, and most of those casualties were actually on the border with Haiti in a city called Gonaïves. So this is really, I would say, another tragic example of how if we don't manage our ecosystems, we actually shoot ourselves in the foot and create more disaster risk. Same kind of situation in Europe. Around 100 years ago, there was a lot of flooding in the valleys. I don't know that we can necessarily directly link this to deforestation in the mountains because it depends a bit on the scale. But a lot of the mountains in Europe were deforested at the time due to rapid industrialization and the need to create charcoal for the industries. So I don't know that we can say there's a direct correlation, but you can imagine all of the mountains without any forests. What's going to happen? We're going to have landslides. We're certainly going to have local flooding. And it was actually after all of these flooding events that a lot more reforestation started happening in the European Alps around this time. So again, Eco-DRR is a subset of nature-based solutions, which is considered more of an umbrella term, overarching, and this is the subset here that I have been working on. Oh, there's a little arrow to that one as well. Okay, great. Now, we tend to think of with climate change and nature-based solutions that they're two kind of sister societal challenges or sides of the same coin, with, I would say, 80% being a lot of the same challenges and perhaps just kind of minor differences between climate change and disaster risk reduction. Not sure if I want to go into that, Martha. You may have already talked about that. I'll keep going. We can come back to that later if we have time. What's extremely important is taking a landscape approach or a watershed approach for reducing disaster risks. And I really like this diagram taken from the catalog of nature-based solutions developed by the World Bank. If we're going to solve flooding in an urban area, we can't start at the city limits. We really need to look upstream as to see where the water comes from. What's the root cause of the problem? Is it just having to do with water in the city, or is the flooding problem happening, above the city? An example, some of you might be from New York City. In New York City, around 15 years ago, they did a huge study comparing, they knew that they had to redo their sewer system, and they were dealing with a lot of flooding issues that they couldn't handle. So they had two alternatives. One was to develop a green infrastructure program, where they also worked on developing areas where the water could infiltrate above the city, or doing a gray infrastructure project. They did the cost-benefit analysis on that. I didn't include that diagram here, and they found that it was cheaper to do a green infrastructure program. So that's what they did. So they also worked a bit more upstream. They developed a lot of more pervious surface areas and parking lots, so-called bioswales, which are basically taking out the pavement of sidewalks and putting planter boxes in the middle of sidewalks to make sure that water infiltrates and also waters the trees in the city. Another example, which I just mentioned, are protection forests in the Alps, which actually started being documented around the 1300s, and were signed into law in, I think, in the 1860s, about the same time as these big flooding events were taking place. So forests are managed in the Alps, especially in Switzerland, France, and Austria, really to mitigate risk, and they are done in conjunction with landowners who are obliged to follow certain laws, and they're not allowed to cut trees on their own land as they want to. This is a very well documented way of reducing disaster risk, which is very well established in the literature as well. River renaturization or rewilding is something that is really big in Europe, but also in the US. The US Army Corps of Engineers, after centuries of creating dikes, a red light or a light went up in there, a light bulb went up in the minds of some people at the US Army Corps of Engineers that actually the dikes were creating more damage than good. So here in the Netherlands, for example, there was a huge process over a decade with lots of public hearings and consultations, and people agreed to actually give more space to the river and allow certain areas to be flooded, therefore reducing what? Reducing their exposure, right? So basically they decided even some smaller towns moved away from the river. They made recreational areas out of places that used to get flooded a lot, and they either removed the dikes or they made them much wider. And this is also happening in the US. Because of course, meandering rivers, they're going to reduce water velocity versus having something straight. I even read something about the LA River Channel, which is one of the straightest river channels. I grew up in Los Angeles, and it was this straight, big, huge concrete river channel. And I even read that in LA, they're trying to make it a bit more meandering, following a more natural pathway. Sponge cities in China is a really interesting concept, kind of similar to the New York City concept of green infrastructure, where I think it makes a lot of sense, right? Trying to create as many opportunities for rainwater to infiltrate into the ground, into the aquifer, rather than creating flooding. This is something that is now, I would say, almost a worldwide concept that is being used a lot in Europe and in India as well, and many countries in the global south also. So this is an example of what a green sponge city looks like in China, where they have created this nice water walkway areas for where water can flow, and areas that can be flooded, such as recreational areas that could be seasonally flooded. Now, when I see something like this, I always ask the question, well, what was here before? Were people living here before? Were they forced to move? Where did those people go? So I did have the opportunity to ask professors some of those questions. Well, what happened to the people living here? And to some people who had lived through this kind of urban transformation, they were telling me that people got much better housing than what they had before, and that they were very happy living elsewhere. Okay, yeah, well, now we also have to be a bit aware of what happens when we do nature-based solutions in an urban area. It does increase property values. If you're living in an area that was really crowded before, and all of a sudden you now have a view over a beautiful green area, guess what? Your rent's going to go up a lot. You may not be able to afford to live there anymore. So justice, I would say, equity issues are also extremely important when we look at nature-based solutions, especially in crowded cities where real estate can be very expensive. Peatlands are also extremely important. And nature-based solutions, again, in cities can go from really micro scale. Again, these are examples of bioswales I tried to explain before, where you remove more of the sidewalk to allow the water to infiltrate. Building solutions, we're seeing this is really trendy now, also in airports, but they really can have a cooling effect, reflective materials, underground water storage, etc. There are more and more technical solutions to cooling down our cities, and there is a lot of demand actually by World Bank clients, meaning governments, especially of the global south, which are dealing with huge heat issues, to do more and more of this urban transformation. There really is a revolution now, you may have noticed this yourself, in urban planning to include nature-based solutions for human well-being. Sand dunes we've already talked about. Seagrasses is an often overlooked but very effective, can be in a very effective way of reducing wave energy, but also of trapping CO2. Which brings me to an important point, which is the multifunctionality of ecosystems and nature-based solutions, not only in protecting us, but also in CO2 uptake. And as mentioned before, for biodiversity, for human well-being, for human mental health, and many, many more other benefits that we would not get necessarily from a gray wall. So this is all great, and we've been talking about this for 2 decades now, and it's happening more and more. And what's happening now is that in order for a decision maker to say, okay, I have a problem. My city is now being flooded more and more. I need to decide, am I going to strengthen my dikes, or am I going to go for nature-based solutions? And I know how much the dikes are going to cost. I can calculate how much the concrete walls are going to protect. If I do a nature-based solution, how is that going to compare? So we really need to get into more of the nitty-gritty ecological engineering type of performance indicators so that we can compare gray and green solutions. I know that Marta and her colleagues have done a really great job in comparing some of the literature on this, and they have come up with really astonishing results in one of the papers that they have published that does show that nature-based solutions do compare very well to gray solutions. So we're very excited about the findings from Marta's paper. We need to know these answer these kinds of questions. Great, coral reefs reduce hazard inputs, but how much as compared to like a gray wall? Reduces exposure, does it always? And what types of ecosystems? Do ecosystems reduce vulnerability? Even with climate change, what happens when the coral reef gets bleached? Will it still offer the same kind of protection? So as we approach more issues related to climate change, we also have to be cognizant that in some cases, our ecosystems may not hold up as well. Others may perform better. Let me just give you a quick example where research is now shifting. For example, in the Alps, those protection forests, there's lots of research on them to see whether protection forests, as the tree line moves higher up the mountain, and as the type of tree changes with climate change, in the Alps, we're now seeing a shift from coniferous trees to more deciduous trees, and they are less effective at reducing landslides, avalanches, and rockfall as compared to coniferous trees. But they are moving higher up the mountain. So there's a bit of trade-off there, and forest ecologists and mountains are trying to figure out if there needs to be some kind of policy shift in how we manage protection forests because of climate change. This will be a new frontier, I think, for research also. Like if coral reef protects certain parts of the coastline, what will happen if there is die-off of coral reefs? So we need to be cognizant of this looking forward. But we don't want this, do we? This is an example of a huge wall in Japan after the after the Great Japan earthquake, when so many people died. This is probably not great for mental health, right? But people need to feel that they're protected. So how do we find these compromises? Here's an example of a compromise which at least looks good on paper, which is having these hybrid solutions where you may have shorter coastal breakwaters with a forest planted behind it. Breakwaters can be extremely detrimental to coastal morphology because of the very dynamic nature of coastal ecosystems. So it's very tricky when we try to put any gray infrastructure along coastal areas. So it needs to be done with caution. Any groin that sticks out into a coastal area will usually protect just the beach of a hotel right next to it, but create more erosion for the hotel next door. So it's really is something that can be very, very difficult. But here, note that we have moved here, at least on paper, they have moved residential area away from the main area of danger, again, reducing the exposure. So here's where we might combine a nature-based solution with good land use planning. It won't suffice to just put in trees if people are living right behind the trees and they still get affected by a tsunami. The nature-based solution will not be effective unless we move people further away from the coastline. But there could be many issues with this plan and something that we could further discuss, but I'll keep going in the interest of time. So what next? I'm actually extremely excited. We have seen so much progress over the last 20 years. I mean, we went from a situation where nobody was listening to us. They're like, what, ecosystems and disasters? What are you guys talking about? We even had to convince IUCN that this was of interest. IUCN would not even listen to us in the very beginning that ecosystems and disaster risk reduction were an important topic. Now the World Bank is talking about it. The World Bank has its own nature-based solutions team, to which I've been contributing in the last year. And they are working now with governments who are more and more asking for training on this topic. And they are looking to how to invest in nature-based solutions for reducing disaster risk and not just building walls. And when the World Bank does something, we can criticize the World Bank for a lot of things, and I do, but I am very happy that they're working on nature-based solutions because they're putting in the resources needed to come up with performance standards, performance indicators, and to quantify some of these things to which we have not had any answers in the last 2 decades. Again, Engineering with Nature, which is a product of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, is also trying to come up with some of these technical answers and looking into natural and engineering processes. And these are the kinds of blueprints that engineers need to convince policymakers that they can go with nature-based solutions and not just with gray infrastructure. And this is where things start to change, is when these kinds of actors are working with these types of issues and trying to solve some of these tricky technical issues. Again, in the EU, nature-based solutions is a huge research agenda. Funding different types of projects with case studies around Europe, also trying to come up with similar types of performance indicators. I know that Marta has been working with, and maybe you've heard from Yaro Misiak, right? Working on Naturance, which is one of these EU-funded nature-based solutions programs, trying to understand how insurance can be part of the equation. So I'm very optimistic with what's going on in terms of where we have arrived since I started working in this field 20 years ago. And things have really, really accelerated in the last 5 years. And so I remain very optimistic. Again, private investment in NBS is quickly evolving, may not be fast enough. A lot of it might be greenwashing. And we need to be mindful of that. But I do think that there are some really good and interesting pathways. I follow this organization called carboncredits.com. They send out weekly recaps of what's happening in the market for nature-based solutions. If you see towards the bottom here, we have compliance. This is from 2023, so I should probably get an updated version of this. But there are, as maybe you've already talked about in the class here, compliance markets for carbon credits, and there are voluntary markets. And look, here's a nature-based offset. In other words, when you fly somewhere, you may feel bad about that. I do. And I then actually send money to an organization that does carbon offsets. And those can be traded on the market. Now, the market has been shifting quite a lot because this voluntary market is quite young and it does not have a really good regulatory board yet to stabilize it a bit more. And there has been some bad press on how to monitor these carbon credit markets. For example, there's an organization called Verra, which is probably the most well-known organization that does monitoring but also accepts your money, I believe, directly to invest in, let's say, reforestation in Brazil. Now, the monitoring system they had set up was discredited by The Guardian, I think last year. And the market really just took a huge nosedive because people lost trust in this market, because you're saying, well, you're not monitoring it properly. You're overstating how much carbon you can actually reduce. And I think it was probably healthy, because that means that the monitoring systems really need to be a lot more robust in order to create more confidence and for this voluntary market to become more mature. So this is what's happening right now. And I know there's a lot of criticism towards carbon credits, saying, well, we can't just go plant trees and not reduce our carbon emissions. A lot of youth groups are actually really pushing back against carbon credits and saying, this is bogus, guys. You can't just plant trees and not mitigate. That's true. We have to mitigate. We have to reduce our carbon footprint. But I also believe that there is a good place for trying to find funding for restoration projects. And so I'm actually quite supportive of these voluntary markets, and hopefully that they will be properly monitored and become more mature. A lot of large retirement funds are investing in various types of carbon credit fund mechanisms. This is a bit old, but we see a lot of big investments now happening. A lot of it might be greenwashing, yes, and we need to make sure that the funds are going to the right place. This is from a figure from the UNEP 2022 State of Finance of Nature, which shows that most finance is public finance in nature-based solutions. Very little is private financial flows. And this is something to keep our eye on. I believe the next study will be coming out soon, but there definitely is a huge gap in the amount of funding that is out there and that is needed in order to meet our climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation targets. So nature-based solutions is a hot topic. It is controversial as well. And it's mentioned in all of these huge conference of parties, these COPs, and I thought I would just mention a few that I have been involved with. Why is it controversial? There's a lot of criticism of it being greenwashing. A lot of Indigenous peoples are not happy with it. They feel that nature-based solutions and whoever's doing reforestation are not taking their concerns into consideration and are doing land grabbing. So that's been a really good eye-opener for IUCN, who didn't expect this to happen. And so actually there's been pushback at the latest convention on COP16 in Cali in Colombia this year. There was pushback by Indigenous peoples against the use of nature-based solutions. Several governments opposed the use of that. So there has been discussion of going back to using the term ecosystem-based approaches instead of nature-based solutions, which might seem really picky. And that's kind of typical of these UN huge conventions, is a lot of wordsmithing and arguing over small terms when we're seeing our globe burning up and we're arguing over terms. Yeah, what to do? The same thing has happened at the UN Convention on Climate Change. That one took place in Azerbaijan this year. I didn't attend either of these in person, but I heard that a lot of the same bickering happened there. There's a huge discussion on loss and damage, which you may have heard of, which is really the Global South requesting basically reparations for the damage that they are mainly victims of, and wanting the Global North to pay for that. It's understandable, but there's been a huge block now in advancing on meeting targets due to this discussion, which is mainly, to me, kind of a leftover of of colonization, really. So it's very understandable, but is creating a big bottleneck right now. I attended in person for the first time in my life, actually, a COP, which is the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And this is the organization that I'm mainly working for. And so what happens at these COPs is that you'll have the formal processes, which is governments negotiating how to achieve different targets. And those are government negotiations, which you can join if you are part of the blue zone. The blue zone is a more highly secure part of these COPs. The green zone, and in the blue zone, you can also have lots of organizations that are having sessions. So we organize lots of sessions within the blue zone. Basically, there are different events and talks that you can go to. Some kind of media activities, like we played football or some, there were a couple of kind of fun media events to get more attention to our booth. And there's the green zone. The green zone is where civil society has their home and where they have space to also have debates, booths, and various sessions. And so that's where all of these COPs took place this year. So we had people flying from Cali to Azerbaijan and to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, which is where this UN-CCD COP took place. I spoke with some people who had been to all three. They look absolutely exhausted. And they're like, why are we doing 3 COPs? These are the 3 Rio Conventions, by the way, right? After the Rio Convention in 1992, UNEP was created, the UN Environment Project. And these 3 different conventions were created. And these are 3 binding conventions as compared to the other ones that I have up here on the board. Ramsar, I'm not sure. Ramsar might also be binding. Anyway, these are the 3 Rio conventions. We, as part of the Partnership for Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction, are trying to push for cohesion and integration between the 3. And there's a whole political process behind why this might be tricky, but this is something that we, together with Yvonne Waltz, I think you've talked to her from UNU and others, we had a huge event on this, trying to push for that. I also went to the World Urban Forum, which was really interesting. That one took place in Cairo. This is not necessarily a place where there are necessarily negotiations, but where city mayors get together and talk about the future of their cities. And there was a lot of talk about nature-based solutions. So there was a lot of interest there. The Sendai framework is mainly where disaster risk reduction is discussed, and nature-based solutions has finally become a big part of their program. The Ramsar Convention on Wetlands is very important, as is the UNESCO Man and Biosphere Program. So I think at this point, you guys are getting tired of hearing me speak. And I'm almost done, because statistically, I know that at this point, your brains are going to stop listening to me and you're going to start looking at the news instead. There's nothing interesting in the news, guys, so keep listening to me. I'm almost done. So this was the pushback from the Indigenous Environmental Network saying, that their understanding is that nature-based solutions do not prioritize biodiversity, they prioritize profit. And they're saying that that there is this fortress conservation model, means tree versus people. And this is contradicted by Indigenous people having lived in forests for millennia. So there's a misunderstanding, I think, amongst a lot of people about what nature-based solutions are, which means that there is a need for more information on what are nature-based solutions. So I think there's plenty of opportunity out there. If you haven't heard about our MOOC, which we launched in 2020, and it's been extended, I think, 3 or 4 times, please do sign up. It has 100,000 people now signed up. We're really excited about that, and 20,000 who have completed our MOOC. So here's how you can register, and I'm sure Marta will share my slides so you can take the time to take a look at this. I currently work for the G20 Global Land Initiative, which is part of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. I'm creating your university curricula. You can currently download the one on innovation in sustainable agriculture for land restoration if you go to this link. We have many other courses coming up, one on urban, and we'll have a new MOOC that I'll develop next year. There are many opportunities there. If you go to our website, we have an opening for interns. We have different call for proposals. We have a youth ecopreneur program. This was for last year. I think that'll be another call for applications for 2025, where we mentor young people who have ideas on land stewardship. We have a grant program as well, and we have a newsletter that you can sign up to. You can follow the link there. We have an internship program and a call that's open now till the end of the month. And job opportunities, if you go to the PEDRR newsletter, you sign up for the PEDRR newsletter, and you can find out about job opportunities there and internships. Unfortunately, UN internships are not paid, but many of them are remote, so you don't need to fly to Geneva or to Bonn to work for us. I also want to show, because I'm very proud of the opportunity that I've had in working with Marta and a huge team, some of the publications that we've come out with in the last couple of years on scientific evidence for ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. Here's the really good, fantastic article that Marta recently published, and a special issue that we recently co-published on the evidence of nature-based solutions. So with that, I'll stop talking because I wanted to leave enough time for questions. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think you can hear virtual applause from everybody. This was a very, very helpful presentation to provide background and context, and you went above and beyond, offering so many resources to our students also in terms of professional development. I'm very grateful for this, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody else. There are already several questions and comments in the chat. I'm gonna try to aggregate a few, maybe, and you can answer them.
You know, Marta, I'm sorry I talked for so long. I was looking at the timing in Zoom, and I thought I'd only spoken for 30 minutes, but I see that I spoke for much longer, so I do apologize for that.
No, it was very interesting. I'm sure everybody's very happy. We have already one hand up, but we also have several questions in the chat. If you don't mind, Elisha, waiting just for a second, we're going to ask a couple of questions from the chat that popped up a while ago, and then we're going to also allow students to ask questions directly, if it's okay. There is a question that emerged early on after you discussed about the possible discussion around the term nature-based solutions. So what is the reasoning behind not liking the term nature-based solutions? And this is a question from Melba.
Yeah, well, myself, I like it, but I think I gave some of the criticism from like the Indigenous Environmental Network, where there's an understanding that nature-based solutions is about greenwashing. Unfortunately, it has been used for greenwashing. And so that's where some people just consider it to be greenwashing without seeing what the definition really is, which is biodiversity and human well-being. So there has been pushback because it has been misused. But for me, it's also a mark of its success. It has been very successful in getting the term out there to the public. And when you get it out there, like with any other term like sustainable development, it's going to be misused. So it's not a problem with the term per se, but how it's been interpreted.
Thank you, Karen. There is one other question that I wanted to share before letting Elisha ask his question in person. And I invite anybody also to ask questions in person if they wish to. Enrique Urbina asked, I agree with your questioning of what is a native ecosystem. Wouldn't you think, however, that we should also question what we mean by restoration and if it's productive for our future? It seems that it is a common objective among many efforts, but I always wonder, for example, to which point in time they wish to restore ecosystems or how they will be able to restore them if some of the biodiversity is critically endangered. Thinking, realizing about a greater past and trying to go back. So maybe.
Yeah. Should I wait for that question to be asked again, or should I go ahead?
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're having a huge debate on that in our team as we're developing a course on urban land restoration. What does that mean? And what we're trying to say is we want to at least move the needle a bit more towards addressing some of our goals of heat waves and human well-being in cities, for example. So we may not be able to restore in an urban area. It doesn't really make sense, right? But we want to at least provide more greenery and provide more ecosystem services. So it's more about increasing the number of ecosystem services that are there for the sake of biodiversity, for the sake of connectivity, but also for human health and human well-being. So yeah, I agree that it's very problematic, the topic of restoration and where we want to restore to, and it's going to be very much case specific. We have a bit of an argument with the Society on Ecological Restoration on that point. They're very dogmatic on that, but we're at least, when I say we, with the G20 Global Land Initiative, at least trying to move the needle towards a bit greener and a bit more ecosystem services.
Thank you, Karen. Elisha, you would like to ask your question?
Yeah, please. Thank you very much, Prof, for this presentation. And my question has to do with being a researcher. What happens when you kind of be in a field and then the community has this strong emotional and cultural attachments to their area, and then implementing these nature-based solutions? You have to move them from this area. What approaches do you think will be best for us to use in implementing these NBS solutions in these areas?
Yeah, no, definitely. There's no question that one should not, when you say moving people from areas, I think the only reason for people to move around away from an area is if they are in danger, right? If they are in danger, physical danger. I'm not saying they should move away so that we can plant trees for the sake of planting trees and having more monkeys living there. Okay, it's really if they are physically in danger. And so in that case, what do we have instead, right? But it really has to do with reducing our risks. And it's very difficult to relocate people. People don't normally want to move. Even when they are in danger, they prefer to live there and say, I'll take the risk of living where I'm living because my ancestors are buried here and this is where I live. But it's a societal question. Do we protect people even if they don't want to be protected? In Europe, you're not allowed to build in a red zone. And in some European countries, especially in Switzerland, they'll move you away if you are really in a danger zone. That's it. In the US, what we're seeing is that you no longer get insurance. And that's a good incentive to not build in a place where you shouldn't be building. It's tricky. It's tricky, Alicia. I don't have a really good answer for you, although I'm just seeing with horror what's happening in LA right now. I see.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alicia, for the question.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Karen. This answer, Karen, is connected also to a question from Haley. Haley, would you like to ask your question in person?
Sure. Yeah, I just had a question about your slide about the smaller seawall, and then you plant the park, and then you move the residents back. In my hometown, people live like right on the beach, and I was just wondering how you think that would go over policy-wise, just because I can't picture anyone who lives on the beach being willing to move away.
Yeah. You probably, if this is in North Carolina, I've seen a lot, beachfront homeowners are no longer getting insurance. Yeah, I don't know, it's a choice. And this happened in Sri Lanka also after the Indian Ocean tsunami, where policymakers saying, oh, you need to move to fishermen, you need to move away from the beach, like 3 kilometers away from the beach. Well, how are these fishermen going to live if they live away from the beach and their livelihoods? Yeah, so it's a really good policy question, Haley, and I don't have a good answer for you. It depends on what you think is more important. Now, if you have really good evacuation system and you can temporarily reduce exposure and get the heck out of there, then you are reducing your exposure. Your home may not be there when you get back, and you may not afford to be able to rebuild it. That's your own choice, I suppose. But those are really tricky questions, and it is happening through insurance a lot and people losing their homes. Who's going to be able to rebuild in the Pacific Palisades, except for Paris Hilton, maybe?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Haley, and thank you, Karen. And Padmi has a question.
I can't hear you, Padmi. Are you on mute?
Yeah. She's not muted actually on my side.
Oh, maybe, can you type your question in the chat real quickly, or something's happening with your mic, Padme? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I can bring up two other questions. There is a question from Saki, which is connected with what we were discussing in terms of planning. Saki, do you want to ask your question in person? Or would you like me to read it? Short question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marta. Thank you for the nice presentation, Dr. Karen. Yes, I was wondering from where should we start thinking about, for example, natural-based solutions just after a disaster happens or before planning a living area, or how should we think of a solution for a living area, for example, for a city like New York or here in Bonn or somewhere, or Belgium, Brussels, anywhere?
Prevention is the best cure. And nature-based solutions are, of course, for me, is best for preventing a hazard event. But unfortunately, we may only think about the nature-based solution until we have funding after a hazard event has taken place. This is where a lot of emergency funding is then, I would say, made available. But nature-based solutions, I think, are much better. I mean, it's a mainly considered a preventive type of topic. Now, one can also think during an event, there are some environmental considerations that can be taken into consideration, but they're more mainly considered like making sure that hazardous waste is not flooded, for example, and trying to secure the water sources and things like that during an environmental emergency. But during an emergency, I mean, we're mainly focusing on saving lives and livelihoods, right? And we're not so much worried about saving trees, and that's the way it should be as well.
Thank you, Karen. There is a question from Abby's iPhone. I don't know the full name of the person. Abby, would you like to ask your question, maybe condensing it, or would you like me to read it?
Can you read it, please? I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi is really iffy where I'm at.
I didn't understand the question.
I couldn't hear. Could you repeat what you said, Abby, or would you like to ask the question, or would you like me to read it?
Can you read it, please?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Abby wrote, I think the conversation on reparation is very important, considering who had the most hand in destroying the earth and who has to bear the most burden on the impact. So I believe it's about social justice and post-colonial heritage. Some of those conversations about reparation is asking for nature to be repaired, and that's very productive. I'm reading Abby's text directly. A lot of these things are not necessarily left over from colonization when we think about how nations and people and resources are still being colonized. I'm not sure if I understand very well the second part, but I guess we get the general sense of the question.
Yeah, it probably had to do with my comment on loss and damage. And I made a comment that a lot of it is a bit of leftover from colonization. She said maybe not, no, not necessarily. But that how resources are still being colonized, and we still have a lot of gap between the North and the South. Yeah, so Abby, thanks for your comment, and it is a very important topic. It is, however, and in my opinion, and maybe my opinion is controversial, it is becoming the main topic at these climate events, and my only fear is that we're getting so hung up on the loss and damage and that we're not focusing on making sure that governments stick to their achieving their targets on climate action. So there needs to be both conversations, and one should not predominate over the other, I think. And we really still need to make sure that governments stick to their commitments, and that we hold them accountable for that. Funding is, of course, very important, but what's happening now, and one reason why the three COPs are not able to come together, is bickering between UN agencies. Each agency wants to have their own COP, Okay, which is not cool. That's a lot of, I would say, so many resources going to flying thousands of thousands of people around the world to these 3 different COPs. There's also this loss and damage. Each time there's a COP, there are negotiations between the Global South and Global North on loss and damage. If we bring all 3 together, there will probably be less of a negotiating bargaining tool also for the Global South. So there's both on the UN agencies not willing to give up their turf and power, and there's also this loss and damage discussion, which involves a lot of funds. So yeah, there's a lot of waste, I feel, in these COPs, and I wish we could find a way of better cost efficiencies. That was a long answer to your comment, Abby, but it brought up that thought in my mind.
Thank you, Karen. There is Padmi who has her hand up. Padmi, would you like to try to ask your question again? Or?
Sure. I hope you can hear me now.
Oh,
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Karen, for the wonderful presentation. Actually, doctoral student who focusing on nature-based solution in New York City, this presentation is really great. And also, one thing I want to add, I don't know, it's a question or the concern, but especially like when you talk about Yala National Park. I'm also originally from Sri Lanka, so I quite know about that area. And then the vegetation is just not only the mangroves. So it is a thorny forest and cactus. But the thing is, when you talk about the nature-based solutions in the coastal areas, that cactus or that thorny or the plants for the arid areas not much considered. And maybe that's a good example for other coast in other countries also, because we always talk about the restoration of mangroves, but never talk about the restoration of cactus or other things that the vegetation is really having lack of attention. And other concern is if you really think about the belt, the worldwide, so the tropical area, the nature-based solution we can have throughout the year, because if you go to the pole or Mediterranean climate or the zone, we don't, I mean, the nature-based solutions are so important, but their full effect is going to be only during the summer season. Like we know, if you with the seasonal changes. So in that case, but the thing is, on the other side, a lot of the countries in the tropical band are very like low-income countries, and their land uses are really changing. So they're going for the deforestation. And how can we control that? Because to me, I think the conservation is more important than the restoration, because if you do the restoration of afforestation, it's going to take another 20-30 years to get the trees mature and do their proper work. So, but how can we improve the conservation? That's what I want to ask from you. Thank you.
Great.
Karen, if you want, I can connect this question to 2 additional questions, and we're going to keep them as last questions.
Okay.
These are questions about planning, I feel, and about engagement of populations. So we have a question from Paul Schulze, who asked, you talked about performance criteria, terminology, funding, etc., as pathways ahead on MBS Eco-DRR. But do you also see research and knowledge gaps for social scientists, specifically concerning governance arrangements, acceptability, and community involvement? And connected to the same theme, a question from Xiaojing, I'm sorry if I pronounce your name incorrectly, I really apologize, who asked, it sounds like in addition to the natural challenges, you also need to deal more with people when putting MBS into practice. From your experience, how can MBS be better accepted and applied? So this feels to be about engagement and participation and inclusion, and I just wanted to bring these questions to your attention.
Yeah, so just really quickly, Padmi, I agree on the different types of vegetation, and a lot of it has to be local knowledge of the ecosystem, and that's what makes sometimes nature-based solutions very tricky, is that you need to have very good local knowledge. The nature-based solution isn't just the vegetation, it was also the sand dunes, right? At least in terms of for the tsunami. Local acceptance is very important. And this, I think all of those three questions are linked in terms of Padmi's question on alternatives to deforestation. It also has to do with finding alternative livelihoods and making sure that the forestation, any kind of forest use of the forest is sustainable. Right, so it could be finding alternatives to the deforestation through higher value crops, through agroforestry, through different types of alternative livelihoods that bring alternative income, right? And there needs to be acceptance of that. In order to do that, one really needs to understand what would be acceptable, and that includes social research. Somebody asked about, that was one of the questions, right, on research gaps. So I'm not sure exactly if we could say there's a huge research gap on this, but it's extremely important to be working with people and understanding what would be acceptable to them. What could be good local livelihood alternatives? 9 out of 10 mangrove reforestation projects failed, Padmi, in Sri Lanka after the Indian Ocean tsunami, because foreign investment came in and said, oh, after the tsunami, we need to plant mangroves to save you in Sri Lanka. Well, guess what? They were done without public consultation of the local population. And they were planted in areas where they don't belong. So it was the wrong kind of nature-based solution because people were not consulted. So nature-based solutions will not succeed unless there is very strong local acceptance and understanding, and it really helps to boost local livelihoods. So whether there's a research gap on that, I don't know, but we always need to work in interdisciplinary teams in doing nature-based solutions between the ecologists, risks managers, and social scientists or anthropologists who know how to speak with local populations, but also in an urban area like New York City, you can't do things if people aren't going to be happy with them. Like you can't start digging up sidewalks if a majority of people are not going to accept them. So it's not just in the global south, but also in the global north as well.
Thank you, Karen. This was actually connected also with another question that we had, with you already sort of answered, because we're already at 11:15 and we're probably gonna have to say goodbye soon. But I just wanted to mention Ridika's comment about the importance of incorporating indigenous knowledge in planning, which is part of this engagement of local communities. I don't know if you want to share one last comment on this point.
Yeah, I mean, obviously building resilience is better than relocation. A lot of that has to do with having early warning systems, actually, I think. Now, yes, indigenous knowledge is also extremely important. There is a really interesting case study of actually that Brian McAdoo wrote on one community, I'm trying to remember which island it was, who still had the local knowledge of tsunamis and saw the warning signs when the sea withdrew, and were able to signal to each other to move to higher ground, whereas other communities who had lost that local knowledge were not able to save themselves. So certainly, yes, I mean, I have a lot of faith in local indigenous knowledge, but it can also be combined with modern evacuation technology, right? There's nothing wrong in combining the two, and I think the two together are very strong. So yes, definitely however we can avoid relocation, that'd be better. But already hindering people from moving into a floodplain like we saw in Nepal, right? People just moved in, even if they had local knowledge, they shouldn't live in an area like that. With climate change, local knowledge may be a bit overburdened because we no longer we're getting extreme events that local knowledge don't really know how to deal with. So a combination of that kind of land use planning with local knowledge, I think can go a long way.
Thank you, Karen, for being with us. I'm really grateful. And I would like to give Karen a final round of applause for her participation and her contributions. Thank you so much, Karen, for being here with us.
Thank you. And again, I'm really sorry. I was looking at I'm looking at the time on PowerPoint, and it was telling me a different time than what it actually was. So I do apologize for that, but I'm glad we were able to go a little bit over time and answer some of your questions and have a conversation. I find that very rewarding, and it's been my pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. All
right. Wishing you all the best for your winter school. And just to let you know that there is a summer school that was developed by a partner in Indonesia over 10 years ago. And so it's really nice to see the Eco-DRR summer school taking place in the Global South and this winter school taking place in the Global North. That's a nice balance there. Maybe sometime you should try to get together and exchange a bit between the students there and your students. So all the best for your continued studies, and happy to stay in touch. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm quite active there. And thanks again, Marta, for the invitation. Take care.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you.